Dante, quote, doesn't attract me. He's full of spite and malice. I don't care for his petty relations with petty people in petty cities, end quote. My reference to Dante was outrageous. I do not seriously dream of being measured against Dante, a supreme poet. At one time, Lewis and I used to read him to one another. I was for a while a member of the Oxford Dante Society, I think at the proposal of Lewis, who overestimated greatly my scholarship in Dante, or Italian generally. It remains true that I found the pettiness that I spoke of a sad blemish in places. Quote, I don't read much now, except for fairy stories, end quote. For except read not even. I read quite a lot, or more truly try to read many books, notably so-called science fiction and fantasy, but I seldom find any modern books that hold my attention. End note. There are exceptions. I have read all that E.R. Edison wrote, in spite of his peculiarly bad nomenclature and personal philosophy. I was greatly taken by the book that was, I believe, the runner-up when the L.R. was given the Fantasy Award, Death of Grass. I enjoyed the S.F. of Isaac Asimov. Above these, I was recently deeply engaged in the books of Mary Renaud, especially the two about Theseus, The King Must Die, and The Bull from the Sea. A few days ago, I actually received a card of appreciation from her, perhaps the piece of fan mail that gives me most pleasure. End note. I suppose because I am under inner pressure to complete my own work, and because of the reasons stated in the interview, I am looking for something I can't find. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. What did Tolkien read? We read him and reread him, but when we start reading him, we start wondering, where did he get his stories? What was he inspired by? Exactly how did he come to be able to write The Lord of the Rings? And sometimes, people are asking that because they want some sort of magic. How will it rub off? What do I need to do in order to write The Lord of the Rings? Well, in the excerpt that I was reading to you just now, this is from a letter that Tolkien wrote to Charlotte and Dennis Plimmer, who had interviewed him for an article in the Daily Telegraph magazine in 1967, and they'd sent him a draft of the article to verify his quotations and to give him a chance to respond. And he's responding to some of the things that they recorded him saying about what he'd read, right? And so they must have asked him about Dante, and he's like, "Oh, it doesn't attract me. I don't read it." No, I actually do read it. And then this, I don't read much now except for fairy stories, which then he says, "Oh no, in fact, I read a lot, but I don't really, and I read a lot, but I don't." And that seems to be typically where we end up with Tolkien, right? It's like, on the one hand, some hints of his reading, things like, that he read Mary Renaud and that she seems to have read him, so that he got fan mail from her, that he in fact liked Isaac Asimov, particularly liked E.R. Edison. But what else did he read? Now, I am, as a scholar, and also, I don't know whether it's fair to say I'm an aspiring author, aspiring poet of doggerel at this point, doggerel iambic pentameter. But obviously I'm very interested in the creative, it sounds like a creative process. I'm interested in where inspiration comes from, and I'm interested in where the stories come from as you're interacting with them in terms of trying to show you reality, right? To show the theology behind them. And so, as we've been talking the last several episodes about where Tolkien got his understanding of creation and the angels and the demons and the mythology that's behind the stories in the Old Testament, I get curious. How did he know, right? Where does Tolkien's knowledge of, I don't know, Near Eastern mythology that underpin the gospel stories, or underpin the Old Testament and the gospel stories, come from? And I think I mentioned at some point when we've done so much together, and this episode is meant as a little bit of a breather from the heavy theology, but I found that I ended up doing heavy stuff to prep for this, and when I prepped for it, I recorded it yesterday, and the sound didn't record, which one of my friends, when I said that, suggested, it was like, this is what masking is like, right? You end up with no voice. So I'm kind of talking to myself yesterday, talking to myself today, talking to you all now sometime in the future, let's take a deep breath and figure out what it was that Tolkien was working from. So this episode is a giant footnote in a sense, but also for me, sort of yet another of these crumbs along the way of figuring out exactly what story we find ourselves in as we're reading Tolkien, and therefore what story he found himself in. Now, my argument has been to you that Tolkien is writing as a Christian, and he's writing theologically with a deep understanding of the Trinity, which he said, right? He said that his stories are meant to be acceptable to a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity. But that makes it sound as if there is a sort of deep theological claim that he's making in his stories, and yet almost none of the scholarship that we have talks about that, right? It's like there are wonderful scholars that work on Tolkien's Christian sacramental vision and so forth, and I have plans, in fact, to talk more in depth about some of those things in the future, but we're still working on just really getting a sense of what Tolkien's own work is like. But to my knowledge, people like, I don't know, Stratford Caldecott, who is absolutely excellent on Tolkien's sacramental understanding, or Bradley Bierzer, or Joseph Pierce, or maybe say Father Andrew Damick, whose works I was talking about last time. What I haven't been able to figure out is exactly where Tolkien's theological understanding was coming from, because nobody ever references anything that he apparently read in theology. So I threw out to the world, to the cosmos, the question, what did Tolkien read? And guess what? Father Andrew Damick mentioned this book, and I'm like ordering it, and now I got it, and so I'm sort of anxious because I suddenly have in my hands a list of the books that Tolkien read, sort of, right? And that's what's interesting about doing this kind of exercise. The book is by Oronzo Cilli, who spent some years. He says he started in about 2015. How do we say? Right, I want to get all these things accurate because I'm holding a book. I'm holding a book that's talking about things that I did. Yes, the present work is a result of research which started in 2015. So he spent about 4 years going through all of Tolkien's works, finding the things that Tolkien referenced, consulting with the librarians. I mean, he talked, for example, with Catherine McIlwain, who is the Tolkien archivist at the Bodleian Library, University of Oxford. I didn't know there was a Tolkien archivist at the Bodleian Library in the University of Oxford. That's very interesting. Cilli talked to a variety of scholars. He gives a long list in his acknowledgments of people in charge of different special collections and reading rooms. He consulted with particularly Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond, who did the great Tolkien Companion that I've referenced. There's a whole range of resources that he drew on to make a list, not just of the books that Tolkien owned, and curiously it's a little bit tricky to figure out exactly which books Tolkien himself owned, because many of them have been sold off and are now in private collections, or Tolkien himself in his own life sold some of his books. For example, the manuscripts of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and Farmer Giles of Ham, he sold to Marquette University in Milwaukee, right? That there's no library, there's no room. I mean, imagine you've seen Tolkien in photographs sitting in front of his personal collection of books, and that doesn't exist anymore, right? They've been sold off or divided among his children, or, I mean, when Christopher Tolkien retired from his own teaching position, he moved to France with his father's papers so that he could spend the last several decades of his life editing and publishing Tolkien's notes and stories, the backstory, the Silmarillion, and all of that. So there is, in fact, no magic room in the world that contains all of the things that Tolkien himself read. And so the closest we have right now is Cilli's list. He says what he wanted to do was give us a list of the list of books we know with absolute certainty, right? So obviously Tolkien spent his whole life reading, so there could be other things that he read that we don't have in this list. But the list of books we know with absolute certainty that Tolkien read, consulted, bought, or borrowed, which means he can see. Cilli tried to find things, for example, that Tolkien consulted from the Bodleian Library collection in order to do his own scholarship. So I'd say it's a kind of good list, but it's still a provisional list, but it's a list of the things that Cilli was able to find traces for that Tolkien himself consulted. If we're going to know, and if we're going to know who Tolkien was, we want to know not just the books he wrote, but in fact the books he read. So this is a gold mine as far as scholarship is concerned, and I'm very, very excited to have it now. Interestingly, and this I found as a teacher even more exciting possibly, Cilli includes in his list, most of the list is the books he said Tolkien read, consulted, bought, or borrowed. But he also very helpfully included the list of students for whom Tolkien was supervisor and examiner from 1929 to 1960 at the bachelor level, the B.Lit, the Oxford bachelor degree, or the M.Lit, or the D.Phil, which means we have evidence now compiled nicely in this list of not just the work, not just the scholarship that Tolkien himself was doing, but also the scholarship that he was advising his own students on, and that gives us a much wider range of possibilities for things that, to say, Tolkien knew, right? I know from my own teaching that things that my students have studied, whether for their bachelor's, their senior theses, or for their master's degrees, or for their doctoral dissertations, I've learned from them, primary sources and scholarly discussions and theoretical arguments that I wouldn't know myself simply from my own scholarship. So we now know some of the things that Tolkien's own students worked on, and reading through this, it's a very interesting list. For example, that V.A. Colvey did his M.Lit with Tolkien at the University of Oxford on religious grotesque in the Middle English drama. I'm interested in that, drama cycles. I'm interested in that because Colvey is one of our great senior, now emeritus, professors on the history of medieval drama, right? So say Tolkien actually in 1957 was part of Colvey's committee, right? Or we have, say for example, John J. Lawler, who did his B.Lit with Tolkien around 1946 on the Revelations of Dame Juliana of Norwich, edited the manuscripts with introduction, notes, and glossary. Lawler later commented on what a nice teacher Tolkien was. For example, I'm in a lot of tongue-tiedness today, so just bear with me. Lawler, my first and abiding impression was one of immediate kindness. Tutored as in an undergraduate by C.S. Lewis, I had expected to be tested with a few falls, so to speak. But the gentle creature who sucked his pipe and gazed meditatively along its stem seemed interested only in what he could do to help. So if you get that image of Tolkien as teacher, knowing that he is supervising all of these students, it's a fairly extensive list. 68 students, concluding with my striking for me to read, Rosemary Wolfe, who did his B.Lit with him on an edition of the Old English Julian, which is one of the biblical poems. I know her work from the books that she wrote on religious poetry, and particularly on the studies that she did of Christ as the lover knight, the sort of romantic literature of medieval imaginative theology, as it were. So we can see in Tolkien supervising conversations that he had sort of going on in the background of all of the things that we're more aware of that he did of his own. And one that's incredibly important in thinking about what theological understanding Tolkien had is that he worked with Mary B. Salu on the grammar of Ancren Vissa, phonology, and accidents. That was her M.Lit that she finished in 1949. And Salu importantly did a translation of this text, the Ancre Invisa. It's the rule for anchoresses. Like Julian of Norwich is that great anchoress whom everyone knows her saying, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. Well, Julian lived in this cell that was this little room attached to a church. I'm starting to feel like a bit of an anchoress myself. I sit here in my room in my apartment, and I don't go outside because it's been snowy for weeks and weeks and weeks here in Chicago, and I talk to you through this little aperture. Tolkien spent a good deal of his scholarly career working on the Ancre Invisa in a variety of contexts. He was fascinated by it as a text in Middle English because he believed that it had a distinct dialect that was significant for his own understanding of the Midlands, right? But he also did the edition for the Early English Text Society of the text, and Salu clearly worked with him both in her the grammar aspect, and did the translation, for which he did a preface. So if you want to read the Ancre Invisa, I recommend her translation. There's also a Penguin edition. So we have some clues of what Tolkien read, as well in what his students worked on. And one of the very significant student supervisions that he did was for Roger Lancelin Green's study of Andrew Lang. Right, Green's Imlet was Andrew Lang as a writer of fairy stories and romances, 1944. And we know, you'll have already heard me mention Andrew Lang's name because Lang was famous as the publisher of the fairy books, the different red, blue, green, violet, yellow. It's 12, I think. And of course, Cilli lists all of Lang's different colored storybooks. Scholarship is like this. You spend a lot of time paging through books. So brown, blue, crimson, gold, green, gray, lilac, olive, I forgot olive, orange, pink, red. Red's the famous one that has the dragon story in it, so I've read more of that one. Violet, yellow. And when Tolkien did his lecture on fairy stories, it was for the Andrew Lang lecture, so he certainly this is great. On the Yellow Fairy book, in the book was found the last borrower had left their slip in there, Tolkien, J.R. or Christopher. The slip we found was left in the book at the beginning of The Dragon of the North, a story about a courageous youth who defeats a man-eating dragon. He manages this feat with a magic ring stolen from a witch maiden. Amongst many of its powers, if placed on the third finger of the left hand, it turns the wearer invisible. I didn't know this. This is why you read book catalogs, all right? In the end, the ring is too powerful, and the youth learns that ill-gotten gains never prosper, when the witch retrieves the ring and punishes him for his deception. There is a eucatastrophe, the term Tolkien coined to describe happy endings in fairy tales, as the youth is rescued and made king. It looks like Tolkien must have returned to consult the Yellow Fairy book at least once more. As the slip suggests, he sat in seat 23 of the upper reading room, whereas the records from the 27th February state seat 22. He obviously liked that particular area of the reading room. Okay, so we have his students reading Andrew Lang and evidence, thanks to Cilli's sleuthing, that of Tolkien's actual reading practice. Sitting in seat 23 in the upper reading room in the Bodleian. Okay, that's more. Wow, you can write best-selling novels with that sort of setup, right? You call up the book in the Bodleian and magic happens, right? Okay, so we have evidence of Tolkien's conversations with his students, evidence of his teaching. We also, which I particularly loved, have Cilli put together an appendix which is Tolkien's own lectures from 1920 to 1959, which it's simply a list of titles of the, in fact, in American terms we'd say the courses that he taught each term. But if you read through how he lectured, you learned that the lecturing practice was a little different from what those of us in the American educational system are accustomed to, right? So, for example, in 1950, 1951, Tolkien was teaching all three terms, and in the Oxford and Cambridge system, I mean the English system generally, and this actually fits with the structure of quarters that we tend to have in the United States system, particularly at the University of Chicago. We have autumn quarter, it's in autumn. We have winter quarter, it's in winter. We have spring quarter, it's in spring, and they match the actual seasons. But at Oxford, the terms are not called autumn, winter, and spring. They're called Michaelmas, Hilary, and Trinity, because they're named after Michaelmas, the feast of St. Michael, the archangel. Hilary term, I'm not quite sure why it's called Hilary term. And Trinity, which I think means it ends at Trinity Sunday, but now I realize I didn't look that up. I just know that Michaelmas is the opening of the academic year, and that's September 29th, right? So in the three terms that Tolkien lectured in 1950, 1951, his Michaelmas term lectures included Sir Gawain and the Green Knight on Wednesdays at 11 a.m., Outlines of English Linguistic History Continued, the Foreign Elements, on Fridays. She's continuing from the previous year, right? Philology discussion class on Tuesdays at 5:30 p.m. On Hilary term, he continued with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight on Wednesdays at noon. Philology discussion class he had Thursdays at 5:15 p.m. That one's in Merton College, so it must be in his own rooms, right? And Middle English Friday, 12 noon, examination. Now I'm getting more curious. It's like you can see a lot of what his life was like from these schedules, recognizing that he's not giving lectures in the kinds of courses that we tend to have in the United States, right? And I don't think even in the 50s the United States classes were like this. The lecture schedules at Oxford and Cambridge, people's degree programs are rather different, and you are reading in a particular field. You have a tutor whom you meet with on a regular basis to read in particular topics, and then the professors, the dons, the lecturers give lectures on stuff. And these things are completely dissociated from each other, or at least they were even when I was there in the 80s, right? You're not hearing Professor Tolkien's lectures on Tolkien and then doing an exam or study work on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, right? At the end of your time as a student, you'll set a series of exams over the course of a week, and you're expected to have synthesized and sort of be able to write very, very rapidly over the course of a week on a variety of different topics. And the examinations are... I didn't take those. I was a graduate student at Cambridge, so I don't have the experience with the undergraduate exams. But you're not being tested as such on here. Did we, like when American students take a class, you're always saying, is it going to be on the exam? Well, yes, everything is. You don't know what the examiners are going to ask on the particular field that you have been reading in for several years, right? So Tolkien, in his own lecturing, was perfectly free to talk about whatever he wanted, because he wasn't actually setting topics for the students specifically to be examined on, although if they were reading his lectures, presumably they'd talk about something that they might have learned in listening to him. So it's more like, curiously, me talking to you here, reading Tolkien for however long I keep going. I have as long as unauthorized will have me, and as long as unauthorized has a platform, I can keep talking, right? And it's a little more like that, right? We read, we mull, we keep going. Here we are in Trinity term, Ormulum and Ayan Bit Ulfinwit on Wednesdays and Fridays at 12 noon, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight on Fridays now at 11. And then he would carry on the next year with more lectures, right? Michaelmas, 1951 to 52. He starts on The Pardoner's Tale by Chaucer on Wednesdays at 12 noon, and Philology, Outlines of History of English, Fridays at 12 noon. In Hilary term, he did Pardoner's Tale Wednesdays at 12 noon, and Philology, Outlines of History of English, Fridays at 12 noon. Trinity term, this is still 1951-52. Outlines of the History of the English Accidents, concluded on Wednesdays at 12 noon, and the Ayan Bit of Inwit, Fridays at 12 noon. 1952 to 53, we go back to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. On Wednesdays, philology, A and bit more. He's lecturing. I mean, from notes. We have some of his notes, and that's, if you are familiar with the Beowulf edition that Christopher put out, that some of these I believe are taken from, the lecture notes. Tolkien obviously lectured on Beowulf for years and years and years, and we have those lectures. Those are back more around the time, say that it would be 20 years prior, right? 1931 to 32. He has Beowulf and Michaelmas term. Text that I don't know. Gubrunark Vikid. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's in a language I don't know. Old Norse. And then Problems of Old English Philology. We have Beowulf, continued in the Hilary term. Atlek Vida and Baldur's Dramar. The language of the Vespasian Psalter glosses. Oh, I didn't realize that he worked on the Psalter glosses. That's interesting. Problems of Old English Philology. That's Hilary term for 1931-32. Trinity term. Finn and Hengist, the fragment and the episode. Also Deor's Lament and Walder. Volundark Vida. Right. So he is, over his career, lecturing on particular texts and philology. And that for me, I mean, as a historian, if you look up the kinds of classes that I teach at the University of Chicago, to me this is intensely close reading a very particular text. I do not have, well, I was going to say, I do not have the luxury to teach text that closely, and I don't really. I mean, when I assign things for my university classes, you have to read a bunch, and then we talk about it, and we move on to the next discussion. There is, however, at the University of Chicago, a program that we call Fundamentals, which is focused more on, close reading of particular authors, and it's that. I list my Tolkien course as part of that potential major, as well as history and religious studies. So I'd say maybe I have that experience, but truthfully, it's these videos that are giving me a much more Tolkienian teaching practice than I get to do as the University of Chicago professor, which is interesting and delightful. But also that it's, I think Tolkien was he's a little bit at odds with his own profession, even in his own day. And Tom Shippey, who is one of his great scholarly biographers, did the Road to Middle Earth and the author of The Century. Shippey talks about how Tolkien, even in his own life, was at odds with the sort of flavor of his own field. He was, in English, as we would say, English languages and literatures, but that he was able to teach these texts and just teach the text and just teach really close readings of these texts and the philology. Even in his own lifetime, English language and literature was moving towards more theory, right? Lit, the lit crit part of what, in fact, say my colleagues in English tend to do much more now, right? If you take a course there in our own department at the University of Chicago in English, you'll be doing much more critical reading, theory reading than you would philology, or the kind of reading that Tolkien was teaching. And that in his lifetime was a debate that was going on in his own department. So saying, I get to do this kind of Tolkienian teaching. Who does anymore, right? It's interesting that the internet is, as it were, breaking open the possibility of being more medieval again. Isn't it lovely? The more advanced technology gets, the more medieval we become. That's brilliant. So we're getting into the text in the kind of depth that Tolkien was accustomed to be able to lecture them on. So what did that mean? He read, and it's delightful to me that Cilli actually got Tom Shippey. I know it's irritating holding books up, or at least Milo tells me that it's irritating. You guys, I just want you to know what I'm talking about. So we're talking about Tom Shippey, who wrote these books, and he did the preface for our Tolkien library book, and he's talking about how valuable it is now to have this kind of list, precisely because if you want to understand a book, if you want to understand a man, you need to read his books. And Shippey says not just the books he wrote. You see, I was paraphrasing him earlier, but actually also the books he read. And now Cilli's made it possible for us to do this, which is well, I'd say it's interesting because, okay, I had two thoughts there, and I was going to be telling you about how Shippey breaks down the kinds of books that you find, and I'm also interested in the way Shippey reads the list and tells you sort of, okay, what mattered to Tolkien is he has lots of dictionaries, right? We have books that he purchased on the Celtic languages, for example, Irish and Welsh, but also Scots Gaelic, Breton, Cornish, Manx, Gaulish. He also read more widely in the sort of general Indo-Germanic family. This is the philological part of his library. Read books on Gallego and Finnish and Lithuanian and Assyrian. He had books on classical languages in Latin and Greek and so forth. He also, of course, had the technical books in the study of philology that, as Shippey points out, very few English speakers now read, right? And because philology has not been in favor in the academy for some time. In the 19th century, philology was the queen of the humanities, right? Because it was, by study of these languages, you get both the history and this sort of evolutionary feel, which is how we end up with Indo-Germanic as a claim, right? That there are families of languages and they branch and develop and such. And that evolutionary sort of flavor, one is to a certain extent gone out of favor, and two, some of the ways in which the philological arguments were made have, I think, been called, I don't know, actually, I realize it's really not, philology is just not something that people do with the character that Tolkien did. Linguistics obviously does do, linguistic development and so forth, but very few people are going to be reading, for example, Karl Brugmann's Kurze vergleichende Grammatik, or Short Comparative Grammar of the Indo-Germanic Languages. Still fewer, Shippey points out, would have worked through now Hermann Hirt's 7-volume Indo-Germanische Grammatik. But Tolkien, we know, owned these books and also made notes in them. So you're starting to see the sort of technical backbone that he needed in order to do all those lectures, right? It's like and this is it's one of the interesting things about understanding what it means to be a professor. And one of my friends asking me today in my Telegram chat is like, how much do you read? And I'm like, more than you think, because you have, and I'm certain that Tolkien read more than is in this list, although even this list is pretty daunting as it is, that the kinds of things you can know to lecture on are different from the kinds of things you can know to write a scholarly paper on, which is different from the kinds of things you might know in order to, really do your research. And there are different layers of knowledge that you have to have in order to supervise a student, to give the lectures, to write your own scholarship. And all of that is somehow in the background of what Tolkien's able to draw on when he's writing The Lord of the Rings. If you weren't scared yet, you should be by now, right? Because it's like this one giant book is daunting enough as it is, but to understand what it took for Tolkien to be able to bring all, he's like, I want to invent a language. Okay, read Hermann Hirt's 7-volume Indo-Germanische Grammatik, and you might start, right? That what Tolkien had was this technical mastery that most people living can't even dream of having, and he practiced and practiced and practiced, and you could see it. It's like this as a treasure trove. You can start seeing how many tools Tolkien had to have on his workbench to be able to write what we so much enjoy reading. He also owned and used many works on English, particularly very interesting. Shippey points out Joseph Wright's 6-volume English dialect dictionary. I mean, one of the delightful things in reading The Lord of the Rings, which I pointed out to you back in, I think, the summer lectures when I'm talking about style, right? That Tolkien can make the hobbits sound both bourgeois and working class. He can make Aragorn sound both high fantasy, as we say, and, Arthurian and kingly, but also as Strider. He's the gruff wanderer that befriends the hobbits. We can have the orcs and their different dialects. Tolkien practiced hearing language on so many different levels all the time. If you want to know how he trained himself to do that, you need to also appreciate that he was drawing on these kinds of books. So he has, other things like his interest in place names and so forth. Much of this is all visible, I'd say, in the fact of what he lectured on, right? But there are other things that Tolkien refers to in his letters, in his writing, these kind of offhand asides, as Shippey points out. It's not possible always to say exactly what edition he's using for certain things, but his books show a great deal of standard literary culture. And again, it's interesting what Shippey pulls out to say this is the standard literary culture. Coleridge, Donne, Dryden, Milton, Shakespeare, Skelton, Spenser, and Swift, but also lesser-known authors as Nash and Rowe. He had a copy of the fragment of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, copy of the fragments of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, including Anna Livia Pluribel, published in 1930, and so forth. Again, I'm not going to say that this list is complete, but it's showing you other elements of what you might not expect Tolkien reading, as well as things that you do expect him reading. It has numerous editions of the text that he actually taught. So going back to the Beowulf, right? We know that Tolkien regularly taught Beowulf. It's one of the texts that he loved to study and to think about and to chew over. What Christopher published in here is the prose translation that he did of Beowulf. It's interesting that Tolkien never published a poetic translation of the Beowulf poem, given as we know how much poetry he practiced writing himself. But in his library, as it were, Cilli lists 17 editions or translations of Beowulf. Other works that show up in multiple editions, multiple reference volumes. Sir Orfeo, Sir Gawain, as we saw, Tolkien was lecturing on Sir Gawain for some years in the 50s, and my copy of his translation. He did do a poetic translation of the Gawain, and so it makes it stranger that he never did the poetic translation of the Beowulf. He used the Finnish Kalevala, the Welsh Mabinogion, the Old Norse poems of the Poetic Edda. He also has in the library, in the sense that we're talking about it now, the list of books that we know he consulted and knew, 7 editions of the Old English poem Exodus, right? So one of these, one of these Old English biblical retellings, and Tolkien did his own edition of that work. And likewise, 9 editions of the different versions of the Ancrinan Vissa, or Ancrinan Rula, including his own. And I highlighted for you that one of his own students worked on the Ancrinan Vissa with him and then did a translation of it. So you're starting to see, if you study a text at the level that Tolkien did, you don't just read it once in the best edition, right? You consult lots of different editions. In his essay on Beowulf, he has that passage that I believe I highlighted for you. Yes, there's going to be an exam. See, no, there isn't, right? Not exactly in the terms that you're used to from American education, because you're learning with me about reading Tolkien, about how he read as he was going along, that you're always building on your experience and your knowledge and your immersion in the stories. Well, when he's talking in his Beowulf lecture about the Jabberwocky of criticism, right? We know that he read multiple editions of the Beowulf poem to understand it, even though he obviously could read it in the Old English, not just that, but he could read it in the original manuscript. You consult with other scholars to bounce your own ideas of what the text means off of. right? Okay, so all of that possibly completely predictable, right? But of course, and this is where Cilli has actually done a nice job going through the letters, right, including, for example, that letter that I just read to you from to the Plimmers about their little Telegraph article. Cilli has gone through the letters and other references to find, well, what else did Tolkien read? Well, we know, he says, that he read notably so-called science fiction and fantasy. He certainly read C.S. Lewis, whether he liked it all or not. I'm not sure. So he said what did, okay. Cilli is good because he gives you notes on what he knows Tolkien said about particular works, right? So, for example, the space trilogy, Pure Landra. When Tolkien's daughter Priscilla read Pure Landra, she told her father that she thought the hero, the philologist Ransom, who had also played a central part in Out of the Silent Planet, was surely meant to be a portrait of him. Tolkien replied, "As a philologist, I may have had some part in him and recognized some of my opinions and ideas Lewisified in him." Right? So, right, that Lewis is giving Tolkien a presence in his character Ransom as the philologist. Okay, so we know that famously Tolkien says he always prefers history to allegory. Well, this is hilarious to me. One of Lewis's early works is The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. Apparently Tolkien recommended the book in warm terms to Stanley Unwin. I read the story in the original manuscript, he told Unwin, and was so enthralled that I could do nothing else until I had finished it. My first criticism was simply that it was too short. And Tolkien concluded, I, at any rate, should have bought this story at almost any price if I had found it in print. So whether he liked the Narnia books, which is why I was looking in here for that, it wasn't because of the allegory, apparently about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. One day in the early spring of 1949, Lewis began to read aloud to Tolkien the beginning of a new book he was writing. Tolkien had said he, C.S. Lewis, disliked it intensely. And when Green met... Sorry, I'm confusing about this. And when Green met Tolkien shortly afterwards, Tolkien said to him, I hear you've been reading Jack's children's story. It really won't do, you know. Okay, so we know famously that Tolkien was about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Jealousy? It's hard to say. But that he did like the Pilgrim's Regress is very interesting. Now I'm going to start reading. Oh, so he purchased the letters to Malcolm chiefly on prayer, inscribed. The book was not about prayer, but about Lewis praying. But the whole book is always interesting. Why? Because it is about Jack, by Jack, and that is a topic no one who knew him well could fail to find interesting, even when exasperating. Okay, now I'm curious because, okay, he's clearly reading C.S. Lewis very carefully, and that's important for my own particular question, which is what did Tolkien know about Christianity, right? Which is what's fascinating in Shippey's little survey of what we learn about Tolkien the scholar from this list, because Shippey points out that one of the things that has made Tolkien hard to sort of get a grip on in scholarship is that he's always seen as something of an outsider, right? And specifically, this is Shippey, attempts continue to be made to force him into a role acceptable to modern academia as a subversive, as an outsider because of his Catholicism or some other cause, as a postmodernist before his time, so forth. But it's saying there is a significant scholarly conversation about Tolkien as a Catholic, but for Shippey, that's never been the thing that interested him most about Tolkien. Shippey was always most interested in Tolkien's work as an Old English scholar, as a philologist, right? And to say that, sort of what makes Tolkien odd and hard to study, my sense is what makes Tolkien odd and hard to study is you can't figure out where his Catholicism came from. Spoiler alert, right? It's this, there's this aura that even, the Tolkien Society has now decided that we need to make sure that Tolkien is studied diversely, and they're having a conference in the summer about that. Vox was posting a little bit about that on his blog now 2 days ago in my in real lifetime, a few weeks ago for you guys. And the diversity is usually not obviously on the religious terms, but my curiosity is, well, where is Tolkien getting all of his theology? Well, one, now we know he liked Lewis's allegory, his Pilgrim's Regress, so possibly there. But you're not going to find it necessarily by looking at the things that Shippey highlights. We do know, for example, that Tolkien is much more widely read in contemporary literature, contemporary to his own lifetime, than this, image of him as, out of touch with modernity always likes to create him as. He was very in touch, arguably, obviously, with science fiction, curiously, because you think of fantasy and science, but he read a lot of what he and his contemporaries called scientific romance. Lindsay O'Neill Stapledon and H.G. Wells, but also people like Lord Dunsany and E.R. Edison. Importantly, he seems to have read other authors such as John Christopher, Frank Herbert, Sterling Lanier, L. Sprague de Camp, and likewise, which Shippey likes pointing out is a little odd, Robert Howard, creator of Conan. So we have, more of the standard adventure writers than you might typically think of. Shippey goes on to point out some of the others. Oronzo Cilli's found evidence of reading William Morris and so forth. With I was just thinking, what was I thinking as I was reading that? There's the Lang pointing out the fairy books, Lewis, lots of evidence obviously that Tolkien read lots of Lewis. Sorry, there was another author that I was going to highlight for you and I forgot what it was. Maybe I'll remember. But these are not the authors that I've been talking about, saying I wanted to know exactly what Tolkien was reading. And the one, of course, that I'm most fascinated by is the one on whose theology I've been drawing, specifically Sayers with her Trinitarian discussion. Now, the thing that I knew before reading Cilli's list was that Tolkien says in one of his letters to Christopher that he was familiar with Dorothy Sayers' detective novels, right? And Cilli takes this as evidence that, in fact, Tolkien read all of them. That's hard to say exactly, but it's like he says, I followed P. Wimsey from his attractive beginnings so far, but this is in 1944. But. And this famously, right, that he tells Christopher I could not stand Gaudy Night. And Gaudy Night is the novel, I think, that either makes or breaks you in terms of Peter and Harriet, right? It's like, I don't really like Harriet as a character, but every academic woman who has pretensions to scholarship and detective novel writing wants to be Harriet because they want to have Peter fall in love with them. And the scene in Gaudy Night when he finally proposes to her and she accepts is pretty romantic, right? But Tolkien didn't like that, and by the time he's reading Gaudy Night, he says, I followed P. Wimsey from his attractive beginnings so far, by which time I conceived a loathing for him and his creatrix, Dorothy Sayers, not surpassed by any other character in literature known to me, unless by his Harriet. A honeymoon one, Busman's honeymoon, was worse. I was sick. All right, which then always made me anxious about exactly how much I could draw on Dorothy Sayers' understanding of theology for explaining the kinds of things that Tolkien was talking about, until I read Cilli's list, and I found happily on his list a book that I was not expecting to find but is here, and that is Sayers' radio play of the Passion, right? The Man Born to be King, a play cycle on the life of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, which was performed and published in 1943. And what I'm delighted by is to find that there is not just, evidence in a reference that Tolkien knew of this book, but actually a book inscribed in his own hand, right? That there's a book plate showing a woman in a window with a manuscript, and the inscription in J.R.R. Tolkien's own hand, Michael H.R. Tolkien, 22 October 1948, from his father, J.R.R.T. And that we even know about this book now. This isn't one of those books of Tolkien's library that's in a private collection, and so kudos to Cilli for finding it. Tolkien gave a copy of Dorothy Sayers' Jesus play to his own son, Michael, which rather suggests that it's worth paying attention to the ways in which Sayers portrays our Lord. And there is this, I say, I read this play some time ago. Some people say they reread it every year at Easter. I think it might be a nice practice. It's in the genre of things like Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth or Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, right? You're trying to portray the events in the gospel, Jesus Christ Superstar does it pretty well too, right? That you're trying to give some sense of the mystery behind the story as well. And that I pointed out to you that Tolkien supervised Kolva on his study of the mystery plays. That matters, right? That one of the things that is distinctive about English literature, I mean, it's like, it's sort of put these things in categories. Like, we're talking about novels, we're talking about science fiction, we're talking about fantasy. Is of course that it's a tradition that was grounded on the one hand in poetry, so you need to understand alliterative verse like Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but also throughout the Middle Ages, particularly in the later Middle Ages, on plays, right? And so Cilli includes in Tolkien's reading Shakespeare, and Tolkien can make sort of odd offhanded comments about whether or not he likes Shakespeare, and what whether in Macbeth the marching of the forest is a good thing or a bad thing. I'll do it better with Ents, right? And so forth. But to understand that behind the English novel lies the English play, and behind the English play lies the story of the Gospels. So here is Dorothy Sayers in this modern radio play trying to capture something both of, as we say, the humanity and the divinity in her characterization of the events. And that being, okay, so I'm collecting hints right here. We say, okay, so Tolkien is really, really grounded in the study of language, right? He liked, which I now know from reading here, he liked C.S. Lewis's allegory, Pilgrim's Regress, which is a sort of conversation, philosophy and theology, right? He likes dramatizations of the theological question, because that's what Pilgrim's Regress is. He gave a copy of this play that Sayers wrote and was reading. I mean, clearly he liked Dorothy Sayers enough to be irritated when he didn't like Gaudy Night, and I get it, right? It's like I like Peter Wimsey in the pre-Harriet stories a lot better, and once you get Harriet, you're like, okay, I know I want to be here, and I'm just jealous she gets Peter, but right? I think it is very, very interesting that Tolkien liked this play so much, and that because I've been using Dorothy Sayers to help you think about what this creative problem means, recognize that she was also, in her own writing, trying to figure out exactly how do you represent God in a story, in our own, like, entered into time. Well, I was thinking, there's a scene that I'd like to share with you that I think plays up this problem of how do you show God beautifully, and as an example of the kinds of things. Like I said, what did Tolkien read? Tolkien clearly read this, and if you're going to get at a sort of hint of what kind of storytelling he's also participating in, it's a good example. So this is there's a narrator character in the play that sort of tells you the events, and then the characters get to talk about what's going on. So the evangelist: and it came to pass that he took Peter, John, and James and went up to a mountain to pray. And the following's all in whispers. So they whisper, and are they awake? Are they awake? We're all right here if we talk quietly, says Peter. It's rather cold. James: I brought our cloaks. Look at the stars spread above the earth like a robe of glory. Peter: but nothing to compare with the glory we saw today in the mountain. James: no, tell me, Simon Peter, what did you see? Was it the same for all of us? Peter: I was tired with the climb. I watched him for a time as he stood and prayed, never speaking, never moving, with his face towards Jerusalem, as though he saw nothing but some strange inward vision that held him entranced. I tried to pray too, but no thoughts would come. It seemed to go on forever. John: as though time had stopped. Peter: I think I lost myself a little, there in the silence, for the next thing I knew was a great terror, as though I was drowning in it, and when I looked at his face, it was not of this earth. It was like, it is a thing I dare not think of. James: don't, Peter, we saw it too. Peter: and his garments, whiter than light, the way no fuller on earth could whiten them. And those two others were with him. They spoke together, but I couldn't tell what they said. The glory was upon them both, and I knew them for blessed Moses, that talked with God in Sinai, and holy Elijah, who passed up to heaven in light and fire. And it seemed that what I saw was the reality, and the earth and the sky only a dream. Yet I knew all the time that the sun was shining, and I could feel the rough stems of the heather between my fingers. James: I had lost touch with everything except John's hand in mine. John: dear James, I felt you, but as though we were children again. Do you remember? When the great thunderbolt fell and I was frightened. James: oh, John, my little brother John, it is you now that stand between me and fear. John: I was afraid too. Peter was the bravest. He spoke. Peter: yes, but such nonsense. I thought the vision was departing. I remember calling out, Lord, it's good to be here. Can we build 3 tabernacles for you and Moses and Elijah and all stay like this forever? So stupid. But I didn't know what I was saying. I thought of the ark in the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord and the pillar of the fire, all mixed up somehow with the holy city and the Feast of Tabernacles. And then, the fire and the light were all about us, and the voice, was it without us or within? And was it a voice at all? John: it filled everything. There was nothing in the world but the voice. This is my beloved Son. Hear him. James: and after that, nothing. Only the sky, hills in the sky, and Jesus standing there alone. Peter: he held out his hand, and I was afraid to touch him, but he was just the same, as though nothing had changed in him. John: I think the change was not in him, but in us. I think we had seen him for a moment, as he always is. Now, I hope you realize why I chose that scene. This is the moment when Jesus goes up on the mountain and is seen by Peter, James, and John transfigured, so that he's shining white, and they're saying how he's whiter than the fuller can make cloth, and that they see him standing with Moses and Elijah, with Moses of the law and Elijah the prophets. And Peter's first response is, let's make you huts, right? Or let's make you a temple, let's make a church where we can hold you. And he realizes that's the wrong answer, because that's not the way you deal with eruptions of reality into our understanding. And that what Peter, James, and John realize is that they've seen, I think John's, the way Sayers phrases this, that they realize they've seen Jesus as he always is. Now, that constantly is, of course, the problem that Tolkien is working on in his trying to tell you about fairy. Right? We've talked about how he reads the fairy stories. We've talked about how he reads science fiction. We've talked about, his study of language. it's constantly, and the voice that erupts into the world too, that John says, it filled everything, there was nothing in the world but the voice. This is my beloved son, hear him. You can see Tolkien's study of philology and language and words as always just this sort of craft problem, right? That he wants to understand the way language works. He wants to understand, the makings of history by way of his dialects. That he has this appreciation for language as a musical, has this musical quality, as a flavor. We've talked about all of that. But he is odd, right? And he's hard to get a grip on. And it's like, do you really just study language all that time because you like the flavor of it? Well, maybe, right? Maybe. But constantly that erupting into reality that he's always trying to talk about and that came up, right? When I was reading what he saw. Why was he reading that particular fairy story over and over and over again? The Dragon of the North, with a eucatastrophe, the ring too powerful. That he goes back to that book. He sees in that story something of this moment that he is always trying to capture. I'd say in his lecturing, in his storytelling, in his aching desire to see God, which is also what Dorothy Sayers is playing off of. It's very much the conversation that the Inklings had as they met between, Tolkien giving his lectures on Beowulf and Lewis. I don't know what Lewis lectured on. I'm not sure there's a similar book that gives us that. That it's driven, if you understand this as a Christian longing to see God face to face, you see now through glass darkly, to see then face to face. It's always that wanting to come back to that moment of the transfiguration when the reality breaks through, when that moment of eucatastrophe comes through, that so you see God, see Jesus as he really is. That, I think, is what Tolkien was always aiming for, and I still think that his reading is a clue to that quest, right? It's a clue to the quest, and so it's still very interesting to me that of the things that Cilli at least found able to highlight, there's so little that would count as actual theology, right? It's studies of words, it's studies of language, it's the poems that he lectured on, it's the poetry, Coleridge and Shakespeare of the quote, literary tradition. It's science fiction, it's fantasy, over and over and over again. Did he actually ever read any theology? Well, thank you. These are funny names. He's Italian. Oronzo. Thank you, Oronzo Cilli, for doing your scholarship properly, because he found the source that I think I suspected was probably in the background of everything that I've been talking to you about, but I don't know it as well as I should because I've only read pieces and glimpses and stuff. Well, it turns out that Tolkien read quite a lot of Thomas Aquinas, right? And not just that he read a lot of Thomas Aquinas. What he had was a set of the volumes printed in 1787, no less, the Summa Theologica. It was in 7 volumes, and not only does he have the book, he bought it. Christopher Tolkien says he bought these volumes in the 1920s. It is a particular note that these pages are heavily marked, right? In pencil, gray, blue, and red, and in purple ink. Over and over and over again, these notes, which suggest to me that it's worth our while picking it up and paying a little more attention to whether or not Tolkien in his storytelling is grounding it not just in this story desire, but also in the kind of theological desire to answer certain kinds of questions. Now, you may or may not like Thomas. I don't particularly like Thomas. That's why I've never really read much of it. It's a literary form that I find highly aversive, soporific, you might say, and not conducive to dreams. However, maybe I'm going to have to change my mind, because, well, for example, if you've read Vox Dei's Summa Helvetica, you'll realize, you'll know the structure of the entries in all of this, which is quaestio on, some particular kind of problem, and I did pick one to share with you because I think it's apropos these days. So we have quaestio with then objections. If you set the quaestio up, it's a yes/no answer, and then you have the objections giving the alternate of the yes/no answer. The on the contrary, which is a suggestion of how you might counter the objection, and then the I answer. So it's kind of a setup always, right? That that if the objections are in the negative, the answer is probably going to be somewhere, well, opposite, because they are the objections to the way the question's been phrased. It's all there's a script to it, right? You say, if I'm saying that I prefer Dorothy Sayers kind of scripting to be able to play out in your experience by way of your imagination, put yourself into the character of Peter, James, and John, know what it was like to have witnessed the transfiguration, puzzle what you've just experienced. That is much more my version of theological exploration, right? But if you're in the quaestio, you're also in a kind of debate, right? And it's worth sort of puzzling over exactly how you come to these sorts of conclusions. That you'll have the question, the objections, and then the answer, and it comes out, I guess, kind of dry, right? But if you read the Aquinas, well, it just occurred to me that Tolkien does get more and more Aquinas-like in his, for example, in his later works, in the later Silmarillion, when, having set himself up a story problem, he then starts worrying about things like, well, exactly what does it mean to say the elves have bodies and souls? If their souls, in fact, are they immortal? What does that mean to be immortal? It's interesting in this volume that I'm reading to you from. It's that kind of question. I chose this one because it has stuff on angels and demons, right? But it also has questions on the powers of the soul, the union of the body and soul, the intellectual powers, the will and free will, the soul's knowledge. Tolkien, in his later works, and when we start talking about elves, you're going to get all of that, right? We're going to the Finrod, Athrad, Andreth, Finrod, Andreth, the dialogue between Finrod and Andreth on things like free will and predestination, and oh my goodness, Tolkien does do actual theology a lot, and started making himself try to puzzle out the implications of the stories that he created. If you read Thomas with that same sort of, this is the footnote to the scriptures, it's possibly easier to get along, because it's the sort of, maybe it's a Dungeons and Dragons manual, if you'll think of it that way, right? It's the kind of questions that you start coming up with when you say, well, if we have these creatures that are able to, they're spirits, but they can enter into history, and they seem to be motivated by envy and pride, exactly what kind of influence can they have on the mortal creatures? Oh, aha! Now we end up with the Summa Theologica. If you can read it that way, it's possibly somewhat more exciting, because it's exactly the sorts of the debates that you get into if you are worrying about how the story, what problems the story creates in reality. Have I persuaded you yet? Okay, so, for example, whether men are assailed by demons. Objection. This is quaestio 114 in the Summa Theologiae Prima Pars. It's got a lot of pars. Okay. Question 114. Whether men are assailed by demons. Okay, yeah, we do want to know that. Can the demons act on our characters Exactly how much hit power did I don't play Dungeons and Dragons. I have no idea what I'm talking about. You guys do, maybe. I don't know. What games do you play? Think about what games you play and realize these are the sorts of questions that are going to come up when you want to know how the characters are going to be able to play out their role, right? So, objection 1. It would seem that men are not assailed by the demons, for angels are sent by God to guard man, but demons are not sent by God, for the demon's intention is the loss of souls, whereas God's is the salvation of souls. Therefore, demons are not deputed to assail man. Okay, it would seem no, so, okay. Objection 2. Further, it's not a fair fight. For the weak to be set against the strong, and the ignorant against the astute. The demons are kind of smart, and we're, compared to them, pretty stupid. We're also weak, and therefore it seems unfair to send demons against us. But men are weak and ignorant, whereas the demons are strong and astute. It is not therefore to be permitted by God, the author of all justice, that men should be assailed by demons. God in his justice wouldn't let them come after us, so no. Objection 3. Further, the assaults of the flesh and the world are enough for man's exercise. It's Lent when I'm recording this, so that makes sense. Like, it's hard enough. Okay, you want to know why Western civilization is falling? Because we don't fast in Lent. And I'm too new of a Catholic to feel the social shame to try to do it, and I'm trying to do it, at least in my head. It's kind of hard. Anyway, that's enough. We don't need demons attacking us too. But God permits his elect to be assailed that they may be exorcised. Therefore, there is no need for them to be assailed by the demons. It's like overkill, so no. On the contrary, however, the apostle says in Ephesians 6:12, our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the world of this darkness, against the spirits of wickedness in the high places. Well, you know how much fantasy literature has been driven by that verse, right? Again, Susan Cooper's Dark is Rising plays off of that very premise, although the Dark is Rising is not really Christian fully, because she gives the darkness an actual power that even Thomas, although he's going to say the demons get to assail us, spoiler alert, within this theology, and therefore within what Tolkien is playing off of, yes, the demons get to assail us, and yes, we are really battling against the powers of darkness, but under what guise, right? And that, for Tolkien as a Catholic, was always a problem, because he wants an exciting contest. He wants to put his characters through true trials, but he knows that Iluvatar, as his creator, I want to say creator God, just as the creator, right? That's why he's God. As the creator, is always in charge of the story, right? God's justice is always working, whatever Melkor can get up to, or Morgoth, as he is in the when he enters into Arda. So the battle is real against the powers of darkness. So Aquinas answers, 2 things may be considered in the assault of the demons: the assault itself and the ordering thereof. The assault itself is due to the malice of the demons, who through envy endeavored to hinder man's progress, and through pride usurp a semblance of divine power by deputing certain ministers to assail man as the angels of God and their various officers minister to man's salvation. So I think there's an entry on whether they have a hierarchy. I don't remember what the answer is. But they do, envy and pride motivates the demons, and they send particular ministers to assault man. For example, in the Screwtape Letters, which Andy Serkis, what is his name? The guy who did the voice Gollum, he's apparently voicing the Screwtape Letters now. Let's see if there's a note on the Screwtape Letters. Okay. He clearly read them, because he references, for example, in a letter to Christopher, the minor imp of Slubgob's brood, who specially attends to preventing CSL and myself from meeting. He references... Okay, so this is a problem, right? That he's saying that, writing to Walter Hooper, he writes that he himself is writing too briefly, but I'm snowed up. I noticed for the first time consciously, this is in 1966, how dualistic Lewis's mind and imagination were, though as a philosopher his reason entirely rejected this. So the pun, hierarchy, lowerarchy, that Tolkien, okay, that, now I'm curious about that Lewis in the Screwtape Letters gives the demons a clear hierarchy, because that's the whole joke in the Screwtape Letters, right? That they get eaten by their own hierarchy or lowerarchy. And that, it's, I mean, the problem is if the demons accepted hierarchy, they wouldn't be in hell, right? Because the whole point is they rejected it. They're basically the OG gammas, and they think, Lucifer thinks he should be accorded, more worship, or any worship. I mean, angels should not get worship because that's reserved for God, and they fall because of their pride and envy. And so to claim that they have a hierarchy seems to go against the very nature of angels, the fallen angels, because if they accepted hierarchy, they wouldn't have fallen. Now I'm curious what Aquinas says, and I'm going to keep looking at you so that I don't look away. But anyway, okay, and there's an unpublished letter in 1963 saying, but then Jack never sent me anything, not even of Screwtape Letters, which he dedicated to me without permission. I was wryly amused to learn from the Daily Telegraph that Lewis was never himself very fond of this work. I, after often, it's hard to read the word, wondered why the dedication was made. Now I know, or should. Okay, so that Lewis didn't like it, and so he dedicated it to Tolkien. Okay, there's something going on there. Anyway, yes, in Thomas's understanding, the demons are allowed to come after us, but the ordering of the assault is from God. So the demons are perfectly happy to do it. No, they can't be happy because then they're not demons, but they do it out of pride and malice, but God lets them, who knows how to make orderly use of evil by ordering it to good. On the other hand, in regards to the angels, both their guardianship and the ordering thereof are to be referred to God as their first author. So we have a guardian angel, and we've been talking about the angelic characters in Tolkien's Legendarium, and the Astari are meant to be guardian angels like that, although for like the whole Middle Earth, the Gandalf is kind of the guardian, sort of the guardian angel of the Shire, but he has other missions as well. And that Saruman is fallen from that role because he wants to, Saruman wants to usurp Sauron's place. See, demons always want to take over places in the hierarchy that they don't belong, and angels, of course, serve within the appropriate office that they're given, right? And that's why Gandalf, as an angel, knows how to do his job and not try to be something other than what he's been given, right? So the demons assault us justly because God allows them to, and then we wonder about, well, okay, in what way are they allowed to assault us? Well, okay, reply to objection 1. The wicked angels assail men in 2 ways. First, by instigating them to sin, and thus they are not sent by God to assail us, but are sometimes permitted to do so according to God's just judgments. But sometimes their assault is a punishment to man, and thus they are sent by God, as the lying spirit was sent to punish Ahab, king of Israel, as it is related in 3 Kings 22:20. For punishment is referred to God as its first author. Nevertheless, the demons who are sent to punish do so with an intention other than that for which they are sent. For they punish from hatred or envy, whereas they are sent by God on account of his justice. So it's like God, I think God's tricking the demons. The demons are just doing what they want, which is, God's allowing them to do because they're envious and malicious. But they can serve God's justice by acting as agents of punishment. Keep working out whether or not that feels fair. Okay, reply to objection 2. In the order that the conditions of the fight be not unequal. So remember, objection 2 was, it's not a fair fight because the demons are so smart and strong. In the order that the conditions of the fight be not unequal, there is, as regards man, the promised recompense, to be gained principally through the grace of God, secondarily through the guardianship of the angels. Wherefore, 4 Kings 6:16, Eliseus said to his servant, "Fear not, for there are more with us than with them." So, stay of good cheer, keep your morale up. There are more good angels helping us than there are bad angels, and the only way, you guys have been listening to Owen, you know, it's like fear is their primary weapon, but they can't do anything without your consent. And that's why it's just for God to send, you know, to allow them to come after us, because they're actually powerless against us no matter how strong and intelligent they are. One, because we have the protection of the guardian angels, and two, because we have the grace of God simply to say no. Right? Reply to objection 3. The assault of the flesh and the world would suffice for the exercise of human weakness, but it does not suffice for the demon's malice, which makes use of both the above in assailing men. But by the divine ordinance, this tends to the glory of the elect. Like, you win a better prize, in Thomas's terms, if you win against both the demons and the flesh. I think this is potentially behind the sort of power of, it's definitely behind the power of Tolkien stories, because you recognize that Sauron and the other wraiths, they're acting demonically, right? They're acting to, exactly what are they punishing the hobbits? Well, actually the hobbits get punished a lot for, you know, they're greedy and lazy, and they might seem like little minor sins. They're not up there with trying to control the world, but they are sinful because they're not taking care of each other properly. We'll think more about hobbit sin, but the thing that is frustrating, I think, to modern readers of Tolkien stories, particularly the materialistic modern readers that just want them to be about sex and failure and, you know, psychological struggle in the secular sense, right? Where was this coming from? You guys realize I have been listening to a lot of Owen because I'm learning a lot from his discussion of story patterns and things. His discussion with his mom on The Darkest Rising was really helpful too. But I'm thinking, oh no, this I heard in the Lord of the Spirits podcast, that there's within sort of the economy of sin and grace, we're thinking theologically, right? But most modern storytelling happens within the economy of psychology, which is always trying to get rid of your sin, right? To say, in like Freudian psychology is primarily this exercise of saying, you know, nothing's your fault, as it were. Unfortunately, because Freud was covering up for the grooming and abuse that his patients had undergone. But that psychology is not about purifying yourself of your sins and your failures, the temptations that we've been subject to, but of excusing your failure to do that, to be purified. So within Tolkien stories, modern readers who are expecting the psychological tests don't get it when what they're seeing are these more demonic temptations, which are resistible by way of grace, right? And over and over again in the story, Frodo is given the grace to be merciful, and it's not really always something he wills, right? It's something that he's able to do. How, right? Exactly how. I think there's plenty of evidence to show over and over again that Tolkien is working very orthodoxly, within a very orthodox Catholic theology, but, and this is why I have always been drawn to his storytelling, it comes out of his reading of the medieval sources more than anything else. And remember, so we talked about the fairy stories that he read and the science fiction and storytelling and stuff like that. The thing that he had to apologize for poo-pooing in the Plimmer article, right? Dante. He was a member of the Dante Society, even presented at the Dante Society, as Cilli shows in his list. He certainly spent a lot of time reading and thinking about Dante, and whether Dante's an allegory or something, it's definitely a journey. Their trials, their tests, right? Clearly, he and Lewis talked a great deal about Dante. Lewis published on reading it as well. And Dorothy Sayers, in the time that she's, part of their community in Oxford, is translating Dante. So I think I'm starting to realize now I have enough pieces of evidence to be more confident in my reading of Tolkien's understanding of Christianity, that it comes out of his storytelling and so forth, that we knew. But alas, oh my goodness, alas, I realize I really do need to read more of the handbook. So if you've ever been wanting a reason to read more Thomas Aquinas, I hope I've potentially given you at least a Tolkienian one, and an appreciation of, that Thomas is coming out of the medieval storytelling that Tolkien was immersed in his own scholarship, and that if Tolkien read Thomas Aquinas, he was reading it for story clues, not simply as debating tests, I suppose, tests of debate. Right, so what did Tolkien read? The Word. To be continued. Thank you for joining me. Watch more on Unauthorized. There will be more coming.